Oh, certainly.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, almost evening. Hello, alumni and guests. I want to welcome you to Reunion Weekend. My name is Courtney Lightfoot. I'm Managing Director of Alumni Relations here at SOM. It is a great honor to welcome you back to New Haven this weekend. We are thrilled to see alumni populating our campus again today and through the weekend ahead. It is so exciting that we're finally able to reconnect with all of our alumni communities here and starting around the globe, and starting with this first in-person reunion that we've been able to do since the start of the pandemic. We're very grateful that you've returned. I would like to extend a warm and personal welcome to so many partners and families who are joining us this weekend. You're going to see and experience for yourself the unique culture of SOM, as well as the passion and commitment of our amazing alumni community. And you'll understand how this incredible institution transformed the lives of the people you loved who came here. It has been a long pandemic. I can't begin to imagine some of the challenges that you've all faced over the last 2 years. There's been so many disruptions, fearing our parents, the health and safety of our parents and our friends. Some of us have lost loved ones. And the sense of this loss is real for every single member of the community. And it's my hope that we all come away from this weekend with a renewed sense of purpose and optimism and a commitment to SOM's mission. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our special reunion opening session speaker, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld. He is Senior Associate Dean for Leadership Studies and Lesser Crown Professor in the Practice of Management. Jeffrey Sonnenfeld served as a full tenured professor at Emory's Goizueta Business School for a decade and a professor at the Harvard Business School for a decade. And he is currently the Senior Associate Dean of Leadership Programs as well as the Lesser Crown Professor in the Practice of Management. He is also founder and president of the Chief Executive Leadership Institute, a nonprofit educational and research institute focused on CEO leadership and corporate governance. Professor Sonnenfeld's related research has been published in 100 scholarly articles, which appeared in the leading academic journals in management, such as Administrative Sciences Quarterly, the Academy of Management Journal, the Academy of Management Review, the Journal of Organizational Behavior, Social Forces, Human Relations, and Human Resource Management. He has authored 8 books, including The Hero's Farewell, an award-winning study of CEO succession, and another bestseller, Firing Back, a study on leadership resilience in the face of adversity. Professor Sonnenfeld earned the 2018 Ellis Island Award from the U.S. Ellis Island Foundation. He was Harvard's first John Whitehead Faculty Fellow and won Outstanding Educator Awards at Yale, Emory, and the American Society for Training and Development. His work is regularly cited by the general media in such outlets as Business Week, Fortune, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Newsweek, Time, Economist, Financial Times, and Washington Post. And not to mention CBS, NBC, ABC, Good Morning America, CNN, Fox News, as well as PBS, where he is a regular commentator for Fortune and CNBC. Business Week listed Sonnenfeld as one of the world's 10 most influential business school professors, and Directorship magazine has listed him among the 100 most influential figures in corporate governance. He is the first...
I'd just stop it there.
Okay.
Yeah, whatever it is. Yeah.
He rang the opening bells of both the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ Stock Exchange. And so without further ado, I welcome Jeff Sonnenfeld.
Thank you so much. Let me begin by saying I am so sorry. Courtney, as we were getting set up here, put out her papers, and I was distracted, as some of you who know me well, that I was going to be pushing the wrong buttons, and we were going to put Abraham into a tizzy as puffs of smoke would be coming off of this podium here. And it dawned on me now, only now, that she did ask the question, should I just read this bio? I should have looked over, because I'd love to blame her, but of course we sent you all that horrible stuff. So by the 6th page, I started to slightly dislike myself as well. I am so sorry. And a lot of you really know too much about me already. How many of you took a course that I oh my gosh, and you never look better, by the way. But Bernardo Augustin, it's not 10 years. I don't believe it. You look exactly the same. And that's a good thing. But now with more than a third of you, frankly, it looked frighteningly like half of you have unfortunately seen all my videos. That puts real pressure on to come up with something to introduce this topic, which hopefully you actually haven't seen, at least haven't seen me show it to you.
Directly to Congress. He said, we need you right now. And Congress was like, listen, we'd love to help. We just made daylight saving time permanent. We are wiped out. So Zelensky asked America to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which we're reluctant to do.
Dmitry, don't get mad. We'll have equal time at reception.
Nuclear war, but we are willing to wear blue and yellow lapel pins at all the award shows this month. So that's something, right? After the speech, President Biden announced that the United States will provide an additional $800 million in security assistance to Ukraine. And for the first time, he called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. And he said it in a mean way. He's like, you war criminal. Really upset Vladimir. But one of the few bright spots in this horrible scenario has been watching these super yachts owned by these Russian oligarchs get seized. And in Norway, this big boat is stranded because the locals refused to sell them gas to refuel it. So it's just sitting there. One local oil supplier said, why should we help them? They can row home or use a sail. Every once in a while, the Norwegians like to remind us they descended from Vikings, you know? That yacht in particular is owned by another Vladimir. Every third guy over there is named Vladimir. Vladimir Strelkovsky. He and Putin were in the KGB together. They're very close. You can see here, they get together a lot to stare coldly at each other across a desk. That's called a Russian hug right there. But we're really sticking it to Putin's pals. And guess what, Steven Seagal? You're next on the list. This is not going the way the Russians hoped it would. Their economy is tanking. Businesses are closing. Assets have been frozen. And the only pizza they can get now is Papa John's. True, which is, a nightmare. But Putin's punching back. He's got...
Well, you get the idea. Papa John's was not that supportive of the pullouts initially. They were a little bit sluggish in the whole process. And how is that going to tie in then to today's topic? Today's topic, of course, we're looking at CEO Voice. And the 3 years that I've been here now, you might wonder what I've been doing other than teaching with some of you. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a blizzard of a sampling of how I dabbled into this topic that speaks to something that goes back to the core of this school. Should CEOs stay in their lane was the topic. Hopefully you weren't looking for the capital asset pricing model, which is upstairs and down. No. But voice, courage, and character, which we'll be talking about a little bit. Seize the day, cover your ear. We obviously have quite a bit of debate going these days about some of the cliches around ESG, what's real and what's atmospheric, and maybe we'll have time to get into some of that a little bit later. I got into that way back when I actually think I still look like this. This is my first book, tragically, which the evil Harvard Business School did not support. They thought this was fringy stuff. But it was already core here because this school had just been created at that time, and Bill Donaldson thought that looking at social impact should really matter. But so did Reginald Jones, who was chairman of the Business Roundtable, Jack Welch's predecessor, and he thought this would start a whole movement. He was right. It just took 20 years. It's sort of like John Scully with the Apple Newton. You can sometimes be ahead of yourselves. Everybody thought, who needs a PDA? And well, we caught up. But anyhow, Reginald Jones and I were a little bit off schedule, but as I came here, of course, we had a lot of the corporate governance meltdowns, and I decided to take on a number of people that were on the school's board of advisors. I figured I'd been through all kinds of career turbulence before coming here. Why not test it some more? So people such as Ken Lay at Enron, and maybe I shouldn't mention more names, but other people that had been on this board and had been prominent Yale alums were on the wrong side of a lot of corporate governance concerns. And I thought, well, let's see if we can, and it wasn't targeting Yale people in particular. There are plenty of people, of course, from from the bad schools that were doing bad things and just somebody from a good school. It was an unusual anomaly, but to try to take a look at identifying that percentage, small percentage of the rogue CEOs and separating them out from the good players. One of them, which you'd be happy to know, I don't know how I could have bought a future stake in this, but this is in 2004. I warned about some of the leadership qualities that I know a few of you were impressed with, maybe a little bit less impressed in the last week, but anticipating off of The Apprentice, if you have nothing else to do with your weekend, want to pull up this article. I did a series each week for the Wall Street Journal and every episode of The Apprentice. They gave me the show in advance to critique it, and he got pretty mad, as some of you know, when I referred it to a kind of like a musical chairs game at a Hooters restaurant, and we got into a lot of threats and stuff. But in one of these pieces, this piece in particular, people thought at this school and elsewhere that I was crazy saying, watch out for his run for the presidency. This was in 2004. But looking at a lot of the governance issues that led to many of these scandals, we thought, well, there were CEOs that didn't have proper oversight, but also some of them had some character issues themselves. And just the metrics themselves didn't prevent it. People were coming out with a lot of solutions, and many of these people, the proxy rating firms, had conflicts of interest then and now that were almost as bad as the firms that they were judging. That if there's an improper transfer of shareholder wealth, they say, which means you're paying your CEOs too much, to find out how to fix it, you had to become a client of theirs, of their consulting service on compensation. It's like at Underwriter's Lab. If you have a broken toaster, you want to get it fixed, you'd have to hire them to be a consultant. So there's lots of inconsistencies between what Glass Lewis or ISS or others would predict, and they didn't predict each other's ratings, let alone better corporate performance. And this is still a problem today. Things that are easy to measure doesn't mean they're accurately measuring. But we got into some of the qualitative parts of corporate governance that speak to a lot of the core culture of the school, trying to understand in the CEO voice arena, why were some honest and why were some boards able to work so effectively, which was most companies, but there were some that were some pretty bad breakdowns. At BP, the BP CEO at that time had been very active in this school and Stanford and Harvard and everywhere else, and they put him up on stages and spotlights and classrooms, and yet he refused to ever come before Congress for a lot of misconduct. And Rick Wagner at GM was actually an old friend of mine from that evil Harvard Business School, and yet there were things that were going wrong on the governance front in so many ways. But when we moved past that era, we got into another era that just had to do with still lingering problems with boards. As we went back to celebrating the heroism of entrepreneurs, this kind of presaged maybe some of the challenges of an Elon Musk type person or of course a Mark Zuckerberg. But we saw it in earlier days with Steve Jobs and trying to rein in a creative genius without killing the freewheeling courage that they have, that they go up against the odds. And some clunky boards were going to suppress the creativity and risk-taking we wanted. But how do you find that balance? And sometimes they would shoot their mouths off in scary ways. How does a board deal with that in CEO voice? And we also had these activist shareholders that were preying on often companies that were, in fact, led by women. It's pretty hard now to find a company led by a woman that hasn't been attacked by activist CEOs. And I thought, well, in addition to taking a look at the strong performance of many of those women, such as Ellen Coleman of DuPont or Ingenuity of here in PepsiCo or Mary Barra, I mean, the performance, good or bad, these women have been targeted. It was also interesting that the activist shareholders themselves, for the most part, had pretty bad portfolios themselves, not as good as many of the target companies, but people weren't looking at that. And the other things that were really falling on the wayside is in the ESG equation, we never were really taking a look and still don't look at courage. People who do bold things. How Ken Frazier in post-Charlottesville led unintentionally, he just speaking for himself, led the walkout of the different business advisory groups around the president. For the first time in American history, the American business community refused a call to action with these three business advisory groups crumbling post-Charlottesville because of some statements that he made. Initially was inadequate statement, but then it got worse. And he just spoke for himself, stepped off the board as the CEO of Merck, he warned his board, rather stepped off the advisory council. And after a slight delay, that led to a stampede of exits. And also on a number of fronts, there are courageous individuals like Ken Frazier. At one of our CEO summits, we were taking a look at coming out of our Corona caves. And we had the CEOs of Merck, which he was, and Pfizer, Albert Bourla, and Alex Gorski of Johnson & Johnson, and the Regeneron CEO. We're ready to get into the issues maybe a little bit early, as in the late spring of 2020, but it was unfortunately just 3 days after the murder by the police of George Floyd. Ken opened up by saying, you know, I could have been George Floyd, and then he moved into the topic and said, no, wait, I think you want to go further on that. And we just threw the whole agenda out of a CEO summit to really pivot to what matters. And no CEOs minded. They didn't complain about a bait and switch. In fact, we had an incredible discussion from that where Ken Frazier talked about the symbolic role of a CEO and how people investing in people like him gave him opportunities. And some of his other CEOs talked about those kinds of things. In fact, ironically, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson joined him on that. But then the CEO of Goldman Sachs, since we're all friends here, I'll name names, David Solomon said, well, here's what I did wrong. I was trying to talk to the group on race issues. And I realized that there are people out there, as I've often felt in teaching with you folks, that maybe I should be sitting down and you should be up at the whiteboard, is they reversed focus on a lot of town meetings. And they talked about a different dimension of CEO voice, but also how CEOs need to listen. So we had this ambassadorial role. We had the internal role as a meaning maker of messages. But then the CEO of American Airlines talked about Doug Parker, how he just had got bumped off a flight coming in. Of all things, an American Airlines flight, and he had to fly Southwest Airlines and a middle seat coach, and he had a build like mine. He's a little bit better shape, but still, neither one of us should be in middle seats. And the flight attendant saw him carrying a book that said, that was called White Fragility, and she said, she happened to be a black flight attendant. She said, I've got to sit down next to this guy, find out what he's doing. And they had an incredible relationship on the plane. They got quite emotional. She was very spiritual, and by the end, they embraced, and because she had taken a seat next to him, asked for his card, and she couldn't believe he was the CEO of American Airlines on a Southwest Airlines flight. He hadn't identified himself, and turns out her mother worked for him, and they're now best of friends. He goes to their family events, but it was an inadvertent kind of thing that we dragged up, where we talked about how you walk the talk, that rather than just the ambassadorial roles of voice, but also the message making inside, how you don't just preach to a group like I'm doing now, but how you also listen, but then also how do you make meaning in what you actually do, but how do you model what you're doing on the personal level? And so, those kinds of things were very powerful. And these CEOs have been coming back to talk about these things, but still a lot of the metrics have been a problem. And perhaps we can talk about that before we close. Is I first got into all this way back then, on this work, because I used to see people doing these after dinner talks on corporate social responsibility, as this was called. Reginald Jones had coined that term, corporate social responsibility, pre-ESG and things. And it seemed like the only meat in this whole discussion was at a dinner talk, was whatever meat was served before the talk. It was just filled with a lot of atmospherics, a lot of cliches. And sadly, that some of this has entered here. Some's well-intended, some is right on the money, and some is, frankly, commercial opportunism, as people herd into all kinds of areas. We have taken a look at what CEOs have been doing on gun safety earlier and now on the energy front. These are CEOs who've been pushing us to get into these frontiers and not nervous about the topics. And the thing that I come to now is on this front. How many of you have heard about the work that we've been doing here at Yale on the Russian retreat? Oh, great! That's almost all of you. With that, we happen to have at our last CEO summit, we had President Zelensky. President Zelensky of Ukraine. But
they're not interactive sessions.
He's spoken, of course, at Congress, at the EU. He's spoken before the oh, you name it, the United Nations the Security Council, and yet when he's gone before these various forums at the World Economic Forum, as in each one of these forums, he's done a kind of a speech to the group, and it was a scold or it was pleading for support or things. We thought, well, let's put something together where we actually have him listening to CEOs. And one thing he begged was no tributes. He really wanted to see what they had to say. So, of course, at the end, I violated that. This was just a week ago at the New York Public Library. And that's the CEOs of American Airlines, and this is Albert Bourla of Pfizer, and that's from Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein, and the CEO of Citigroup's right there.
Zelensky. My name is Kevin Rudd. I'm the former Prime Minister of Australia. I've lived in America now for several years, and I'm a regular participant in the Yale CEO Forum, hence the request to acknowledge your leadership today. A few brief remarks. I think I'm speaking on behalf of all the participants today in New York. Number one, we'd like to congratulate you on your personal leadership. It takes a lot of courage and guts to do what you have done. Number two, we congratulate you on your national leadership in forging the Ukrainian nation in a way that none of us in the international community have seen before. It's been a truly remarkable achievement. And number three, we congratulate you on your global leadership because you've reminded us all again of the power of democracy, the power of the democratic ideal, and the power of defending our own sovereign territory. And you've done this with enormous vigor and therefore upheld Article 2 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the threat of force or the use of force in the resolution of international disputes. Mr. President, I now live in New York. I live next door to the Ukrainian Consulate General in New York. And the day after Russia invaded Ukraine, we did what anyone could do. We baked a cake and took it around to the staff at the Consulate General. Of course, at a political level, governments around the world, including the Australian government, have joined under US leadership to send all forms of military equipment to Ukraine to assist with the armed forces of your country in resisting Russian aggression, including, in our case, Australian-manufactured armoured vehicles. And, of course, the requirement still exists for us to continue around the world to provide your country with all forms of economic support as well. Mr. President, your message today when asked what can the world and what can this gathering do for Ukraine, your message and response was very clear: to ensure that there is a strong Ukraine. And that means a clear message to all of us to sustain economic support to Ukraine, both governmentally and corporately, military support to the Ukrainian armed forces who have shown such courage in the field, as well as support for Ukrainian refugees and asylum seekers around the world. And if I can add one other thing, for us to provide you with the guarantee of long-term support when sometimes the political attention span of the global media can fade. To conclude, Mr. President, this gathering of American CEOs through the Yale CEO Forum is with you. Jeff Sonnenfeld, who brings us together, has led the charge in the United States to get American companies to exit the Russian Federation. And he's done so with great success. I think the message I hear from you today is not just exit the Russian Federation, but now find ways of entering Ukraine and to support through investment countries like Poland, who are supporting millions of Ukrainian refugees. To conclude, Mr. President, you're a very busy man. You're a political leader. You're a military leader. We wish you every success in the future, in the success of your military campaign, and also your economic campaign to rebuild the country. And, of course, to force Russia to unblock the ports which prevent you from supplying grain and agricultural produce to the rest of the world. We'd like, therefore, to acknowledge and honour your leadership today.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you very much indeed for your support. Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, that is Jared Kushner and Ralph Reed and others in there. You might be surprised.
Asked Klaus Kleinfeld, a friend to virtually all of us here in the room. As you know, he'd been the CEO of Siemens, the CEO of Alcoa, the CEO of Arconic. But beyond all that is somebody who lived through tremendous political, cultural, and economic change to prove a lot of cynics wrong about what could happen, what could be done in East Germany. And Klaus, I want to thank you for you to even come up here to present the award to Ambassador. I know he gave you the most inelegant seat to get out of gracefully, but don't worry, you can bolt over that if you can. And Ambassador Sergei Kyslytsky, if you could come up, oh, there you are, to join us, Ukraine's ambassador to the United Nations, accept this on your behalf. And then, if I could have my laptop for 1 minute as Klaus works his way up here, is we have Professor Tim Snyder from Yale, a great political historian, who's just gone.
President Volodymyr Zelensky. Це для мене сьогодні велика честь мати можливість вимовити кілька слів похвали для пана президента Володимира Зеленського. We're at a turning point in history. Historians could recognize this. Whether we will have a world of fiction or fact, whether we'll have a world of baleful homogeneity or fruitful civil society, whether we'll have a world of tyranny or a world where democracy has a chance, all of these things depend upon what happens in Ukraine in the next few days, weeks, and months. History can recognize this. History can recognize these structures. But history also recognizes the individual. History recognizes the choice. Volodymyr Zelensky has made the right choices. He's made the kind of choice that we recognize with the word leadership. A leader acts in a kind of articulate companionship with his people, bringing out the best in them even as they bring out the best in the leader. We can choose to recognize this today. We can choose to respect it. We can choose to honor it. But I would add this: even as we give this man this award, we must be ready to fulfill a kind of promise. The award is a symbol. It's a recognition of leadership. But we will only truly be recognizing leadership if we follow its example. In giving this award today, we ourselves are making a kind of promise. We're recognizing the country. We're recognizing the man who has helped us to see and understand the country. But we're also, I believe, pledging ourselves to the future of that country. Thank you very much, Pan President.
So that was at the close of it. If anybody had time or interest later, we can actually send you the link, and you can hear the nature of the discussions that followed. There were some really penetrating discussions. Jane Fraser, the CEO of Citigroup, was one of the early questioners, for example, and she asked about the role of famine, basically, as we got into what it meant to have perhaps 30% of the world's grain about to disappear, with 18% from Ukraine alone, with the fields unable to be tilled. They can't seed them. There's no harvest possible. There won't be much growing. But the depots, the food storage also destroyed, and also all the infrastructure that's needed. That will be mass starvation, as President Zelensky talked about it, in places thousands and thousands of miles away from Central Europe. What's likely to happen in the fall? We got into this with this little set of company logos you see here. Is that a couple of companies, surprisingly, not the ones that most of us would have anticipated, pulled out with the outbreak of war on February 24th. Big oil, big tech, and professional services. Yes, those of you in professional services know most times professional service firms would rather jump off a cliff than get involved in any controversy. They're not usually on the front lines of social issues. And on social justice issues or obviously on climate change. Big oil hasn't always been on the right side of things, as we're seeing revisited right now this week with some discussions with the White House and big tech with privacy and antitrust and hate speech issues. But on this issue, they moved very quickly before any of the consumer goods companies moved, who are usually on the front lines. And Stephen, our research director, Stephen and I, we took note of this and we thought, well, let's try to figure out what's going on there. And as we were in the middle of trying to figure it out, not intentionally saluting anybody, a lot of fraudsters came along. Companies that were being celebrated by some faux social justice, ESG commercial firms that weren't doing anything. And some of the CEOs from the good guy companies were saying, well, how come you always push us to do the right thing? How about these fraudsters with clever public relations spin? So I went on CNBC a few days later as we went through a list to divide out who was real and who wasn't. And you can see this on our website, that the stocks crashed of those companies anywhere from 12 to 33%. On a day, the markets were only down 5%. And by the way, congratulations on lifting the market so much today. You've brought us all good news. So then we realized that we needed to develop a grading system of A through F. Kevin Rudd, the Prime Minister of Australia, said American companies. It's 1,300 companies, and less than half of them are U.S. companies. It's, you name it. It's throughout Asia, through Africa, in Europe. Of course, they suggested they changed their logos as a result. And if you can see some of the issues. This is actually the team behind it that did the hard work. We wound up getting a great set of student volunteers that are still working with us, 45 of them that worked through the night on all this. But beyond sort of talking about this list, and one of the things we found, by the way, it pays to leave. This is not only that our New York Times op-ed and some of the coverage that we had in the major media get a good deal of attention. The New York Times and Washington Post op-eds were the number one op-eds for almost a week in each one of those places. They kept trending. But right now in the Social Science Research Network, the work that these people have done, as you see, it's highly quantitative. You realize I'm just on the coattails. It has proved that doing good is not antithetical to doing well. What the school has always stood for, that the more dramatically, the more forcefully a company pulled out, the better they're being rewarded in their financial returns. And those companies that are still there, and there are a couple hundred, are actually suffering. And we hold industry constant, we hold geography constant, we hold size constant, we hold public-private. We've been able to look at that. And if you have any questions about that, but what thoughts do you have just about companies pulling out? Do you think it makes a difference? Any thoughts? This is not rhetorical questions. Bernardo, you're too easily identified, but you don't have, Perla, you've never missed a chance to get called on. I know it's not your 10th, it's only your 5th, but anybody have a question? Want a cold call or comment? Yes. Hi, Mark. We have a mic coming to you, Mark.
Oh, thank you. That'd be a lot easier. I have to pose a question in an argumentative fashion because that's my nature a little bit, right? But the question is, should CEOs stay in their path, in their lane? Obviously, I mean, Ukraine is kind of an obvious case, right? And I do think it makes a difference.
Well, is it? I don't know. Dimitri might not agree, but
maybe
yeah.
not. No, yeah, right. That's my point, right? So the question is, to what extent do they become an instrument of nationalist will?
Well, let's is there? I know we have some Russians. Are there any Ukrainians in the room here? Anybody come here directly from Ukraine? Great. Your point of view? It makes a huge difference. How does it make a difference?
Well, by investing in Russia, we're effectively supporting the government, which is invading the other country. We're effectively taking part of that by buying goods of the companies which actually didn't pull from Russia. So it's really life and death difference for a lot of people. No questions asked.
Well, that's fantastic. I missed your name.
My name is Yuri.
Yuri, I was just coming close to see a name tag, but I still couldn't read it from here. You caught me getting too close. And I'm not wearing a mask, so I guess I should keep the distance. But Yuri, thank you. In fact, you're not alone in the room. Not only perhaps does some other people agree with you, but if we could just tap into two stars from Ukraine right now, by chance, if the connection works, could we bring in Timothy and Natalia? Timothy Milanikov is, Timothy, here he is. Timothy is the president of the Kyiv School of Economics. He's an advisor to President Zelensky and a former member of the cabinet. He was Minister of Economic Development, Trade, and Agriculture of Ukraine. Natalia Shapoval is chairman of the Kiev School of Economics, vice president for policy research, and also an advisor to President Zelensky. Thanks, you both. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Well, we can hear you just fine. Timothy, can we hear you too?
Yes.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, welcome to the Yale School of Management.
Thank you.
Does the corporate behavior matter, and should CEOs of other countries speak out on this matter? Either one of you. Natalia, you're nodding your head, so we'll go with you first. Natalia?
Thank you. First, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk. It's a great honor. And coming to your question, I think that matters a lot and in many sense. First is that large businesses, you specifically in this room, is a huge and one of the most influential constituencies that is there in the world, that influences the governments, and your opinions, what is acceptable for you, influences a lot in how the governments and how everyone else acts. So the way you look into Ukraine, into global challenges, other global challenges, is very important. Your intellectual leadership is very important. Secondly, and in this regard, like your support of countries engaging with this conflict in supplying weapons to Ukraine so that we can defend ourselves, that's crucially important. Secondly, this is, of course, leading business in Russia. And some of the businesses are really very large, and they employ Russians, and they give Russian government the possibility, to say that everything is well, so everything is working well, and don't look at this conflict. Sanctions, they don't influence us. But when there is a really clear signal that technology companies, that businesses that work with consumers, those who produce inputs for energy sector or even for weaponry, as we see now, Russians can even use washing machines to be turned into a weapon. And all these products, when companies leave Russia, that gives a very clear signal to everyone that this is a big deal, and that aggressor cannot continue working like that. And thirdly, and I think that's very important too, Russia is leveraging very weak spots. So the energy dependence of Europe, the lack of food in many African countries, and these global challenges, if you help as your business helps addressing them, then Russia will not have that much leverages in the future. Thank you, Jeff. That's over with my comment.
Natalia, that's incredible. In fact, almost suspicious that, Mark, did you set this up with her in advance? She not only had no teleprompter that I can see and no apparent notes in front of her, but I guess you have been answering this question before. But Mark, we can't pay you enough for the perfect setup question. Thank you. Timothy, well, I thought is this an obvious one? And her question is this obvious? Timothy, do you want to?
Should corporate? Your question is, should CEOs stay in their lane? My question is, if they get out of their lane and they're going to take political activism, when it's on our side, we're all going to agree. When it's not on our side, we're not going to agree, right? We're going to be against it. I'm just asking, for me personally, yeah, Russia is an evil aggressor. What happens when CEOs are on marginal issues taking stances? How do we feel about that? Is it a moral imperative? Like, in other words, is it a good thing or a bad thing in a sense?
Mark, great question. Before we move off of Ukraine, then, since you want to make that transition to the larger portfolio of other issues out there are so many issues that you get into the question about, is it the CEO or the board's values versus the portfolio values and the shareholders? that they have a diversity of interests. You also have an issue of how much can a corporation do? How much is it their responsibility? The philosophical question of, the Rawls versus Nozick. If I didn't cause somebody else's suffering, is it my moral duty? There's a lot there, of course, and the issue that having to do with, even if I want to do it all, can I do it all? The slippery slope, and we will stay here till midnight, if even it's just the two of us in the room, and argue with all those. But before we do, I'd just like to find out if there's anybody that wanted to ask maybe Timothy a question as to whether or not it matters that we speak out, or is it as obvious as Mark says it is, that this is the right path, and corporations, should they do more? Are we doing enough? Everybody, yes. Everybody thinks we should do more. Does anybody think we're doing, their CEOs are doing too much right now? Yes. Yes.
A controversial thought about it. That is why I didn't answer to you before. But if I have to respond for what Argentine politicians do all the time, I would be in trouble. And I always ask myself, what about the companies that are putting out from Russia? Who are they affecting? Are they affecting Putin, or are they affecting the regular citizen of Russia that maybe is against Putin?
And this is a lot of the argument, Timothy, if you want to take that, of those companies staying. It's TGI Fridays is staying there. Huntsman Chemical is staying there. International Paper is staying there. Versace is staying there. The Benetton is staying there. And some of the arguments that people had in the beginning was, well, the average Russian has not caused this problem. If you're taking a political position or a military position against the Russian leadership, why do you want to make the average Russian suffer? And that question comes up, especially from the pharmaceutical companies and agricultural companies, saying, shouldn't we have a humanitarian exemption? Timothy?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question about the humanitarian exemption. And I agree with many of you in the room, and we debated it with Jeff too at some point, that I think the answer is a little bit hypocritical to make this defense. Because if you truly are about humanitarian, then you should be giving out drugs for free, both to Russians and to Ukrainians. And you can as well pull out from Russia and increase your presence in Ukraine or in other countries which are suffering from aggression from all over the world. So it cannot be the defense that we're just doing humanitarian, because you can only apply that defense if you have done enough in other countries. And Russia is on margin the country in which the needs are the greatest, but I don't think that's the country in which, if we start talking about humanitarian support or argument, these are the needs are the largest. There are plenty of countries, and unfortunately very poor countries, in which we need to provide support, and the companies could do that. So humanitarian defense sounds a little bit hypocritical to me.
And I know you didn't just mean humanitarian; you meant the average Russian. So on both levels of that, first on the humanitarian argument, is many of the companies that use that argument, the pharmaceutical companies, were actually pulling, most of their revenues were coming from cosmetics. When they were outed for that, the companies peeled those off. And even now, some companies where the CEOs have done fantastic stuff on the vaccine front and other things, most of the revenues are still coming from analgesics and antihistamines, of which there are plenty of suitable Russian-made alternatives. They don't really have a reason to be there. So then they fell back on the clinical trials argument, suggesting that Russians are the biologically naive, was the term being used, that they're reasonably healthy diet, but they're not over-medicated the way so many of us are in other parts of the world, so they make for good clinical studies. Well, it turns out that you could go anywhere in the Baltics and find the same, and many other parts of the world, and find similar conditions. So those companies grudgingly moved on. So if you move beyond Timothy's response to humanitarian, the average Russian issue, I don't know if you ever read Hitler's Willing Executioner by Jacob Goldhammer, a Dutch historian. He said at 1995, I think, Knopf, I think was the publisher, and what he argues in there is that it isn't Der Fuhrer that deserves all the blame for the Third Reich alone, but in fact it was the complicity through the complacency of the average Russian, that only 4% of Russians choose to download a VPN, for example, knowing they're not getting alternative press, and that those journalists who try a different point of view seem to have very unstable balance around Windows all of a sudden, or that there's no alternative political parties, they wind up killed or imprisoned or both. But Timothy, or Natalia, that response about why make the average Russian suffer? Because my argument is I'd like to see more discomfort for the average Russian to get people angrier and out on the streets. But I don't know, Tiffany and Natalia, a final shot, and we'll let you escape, and I'll go back to Mark's hardball question.
Mm-hmm. So if we think about our objectives as the world, is the key, I think, is to ensure that there's no further war. Of course, we would like to stop this war, and we would like to prevent further suffering for people in Ukraine and actually people in Russia too. But I think the most fundamental aspect is that the countries, the regimes which use military aggression to further their political, geopolitical, or foreign policy objectives should learn, societies should learn that this is not the right way to do it. So it's not just the politicians, societies that support those politicians have to learn. And in that sense, the effect from sanctions and from self-sanctioning has to apply to the entire economy. And so that's critical that doing business in Russia has become, and we actually see that the world has responded by saying, by perceiving any relationship with Russian economy as being extremely toxic. And so there is a process of self-sanctioning where companies are living, but it's consistent with the overall governmental international response, trying to make it extremely costly for the economy overall, across the board, both for politicians and not only, also for people, because otherwise the society is, in fact, if you look at the polls or talk to people, okay, there's a question with the polls, but they're supporting the invasion. It's a bit of paradox. On the one hand, they're saying, Russians are saying, oh, there is no war, and at the same time, they refuse to get information about the war, even though the mechanisms are available. And they're saying, listen, if there is a war, then it's justified. And so this is not just the Kremlin issue; it's the society issue, unfortunately.
Thank you, Timothy. Natalia, did you want to add anything? And you don't feel like you have to take the cold call. You're not being graded, but Natalia, did you want to add?
Yes, thank you. That's an important question, and I agree with what Timothy has been saying, that that's a complacency, and that's the choice that Russian people have been making to leave, and it is they have to realize that. Although the primary goal of the sanctions and all this economic policy is not targeted actually onto Russian people, that's not a target. But of course, we realize that there is impact on them. The target is that such regime that hates all the democratic and civil world values, how come they would be getting access to all these benefits of the civilized world?
Well,
so thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. You both phrased it so well. As you both know, and several people in this room know, this is how we saw social change happen elsewhere. I never got to know Nelson Mandela, but I did know Bishop Desmond Tutu a bit. And he told me in the early 90s, just 2 years after the sanctions, the business sanctions, the voluntary business mandate, boycotts, the pulling out, in addition to the government sanctions. The government sanctions from the U.S. was a 73 to 22 vote or something like that. Actually, it was overrode President Reagan's veto by led by Mitch McConnell, and Bob Dole, of all things, led the override vote. But that it was the voluntary pullout of IBM and Coca-Cola, General Motors, that was so powerful because of the marriage of the substantive and the symbolism, that they saw themselves as pariahs. They never saw themselves in South Africa that way before. So this made the message more clear. It's what Gandhi did, of course, in stopping civil society in India. It was what brought down Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania. It had a lot to do with the relatively bloodless change of government with Erich Honecker in East Germany, or Jaruzelski in Poland. And we've seen a lot of evidence that it's mattered to marry the the government sanctions with the business symbolism. But Udi, how did your fellow countrymen do? Did they do okay as from Ukraine? Okay, you got a good grade. Thank you very much, Natalia. Thank you very much, Timothy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. Mark, we're not done. So who has a response to Mark's really great question that I cleverly managed to avoid for all this time? You think I have a good answer, but I do have an answer. But it's yes. It's the question is, how do you decide the issues that aren't as powerful, where, and not everybody in the room may agree, it's not everybody in this country, but there's no split between the parties. This is like one of the very few issues, is, as you would argue, in support of your position, Mark, that on the Ukraine pullouts, it's more than 80%. And even independents, Democrats, Republicans agree, North, South, whatever, we'll come together on that one. But that doesn't mean everybody. But still, there are others that are more divisive.
Well, so as I learned here at Yale, I'm going to answer a different question or bring up a different point related to what Mark was saying.
Oh, Mark's already accused me of the bait and switch, but okay. But
I'll tell you, first of all, I happen to feel pretty passionately about Ukraine, but I'm going to change the focus because my wife said something to me earlier today that really got to me, and that's she's not sure she wants to live in this country anymore. So I want to bring it a little closer to home at a time when women are losing the right to control their own bodies, when we're using tax dollars to subsidize religious education, when we're making guns more available, and when I suspect it's just a matter of time before gay rights are probably eliminated. What do you think about the role of companies about somewhat more touchy topics a little closer to home?
I don't think Mark would say that's a bait and switch. You're right on top. You're just giving a specific example, right? So good job. Anybody have a response to that? This issue is more divisive. A little bit, not overwhelmingly so, is that the surveys, the Pew surveys are 75%, almost up to 80% about a woman's right to choose, but they're an outlier. Gallup is much more around 60%. And you probably know this data as well as I do. It's being shouted at us all the time right now. We see it. Is that most of the country, though, but not by the same proportion, but most of the country is in favor of a woman's right to choose. And much of the country is worried about what this Dodd decision is going to mean for other unfolding privacy protections that we thought we had. And this is, the first times we've seen rights taken away in the country. That is a major threshold. But Mark's question is, I believe I can rephrase you again, is not taking a position that I am aware of on a woman's right to choose, but on the corporation's responsibility to take a position. Isn't that what you're saying? Yeah. Should they? What's your recommendation?
Have a repressive regime, and corporations jump on that bandwagon. Like, it might not agree with me. So today I agree with what the movement is. How about if they're taking the opposite side? And it's not what I believe in. So, that's kind of my feeling. It's like, how do you know it's the right thing? I guess.
So if companies should go in an opposite direction, what's the justification for saying a company shouldn't exercise its voice? A response to that is, you have no objection to these companies getting involved, or you do, Mark?
No, I do not.
These are companies, Dick's just, by the way, as I'm up here on the podium, I just noticed on the other laptop that, and maybe it was earlier, but I just noticed that now Dick's just came through with $4,000, I think, per woman for travel that want to get out of what state ever they're in. And so should companies take a position right now? In fact, is it fair to put you on the spot to raise your hand on that one, or would you rather not that disclosure? Oh, right ahead. Thanks.
Well, I'm not actually trying to answer. I think it's an interesting question, and I'm actually wondering from you, this was interesting to go through a case study, but I'm curious about how you're approaching it from an academic perspective. Are you gathering data where we can see, yes, social, when your social activism as a CEO is aligned with the public's will, you can expect this kind of a return, or you might be out ahead of it, like Nike with Colin Kaepernick, and are you going to see a decline and then the long-term increase over time? I'm just curious how you're approaching it from a dollars and cents and ROI perspective, and academically. Do you have some learnings there?
I'll respond to that. Just tying down that last one is that it sounds like the group is largely in support of companies taking a position here, but they're still in terms of denial of rights, and I suspect many of you would feel the same way about voting rights restrictions, voting rights access. It's another one of those examples where we've never seen rights taken away from us before. Some may argue that the access issue was overplayed, but the real problem in a lot of that legislation, as you've seen it and I've read it, and maybe many of you have too, is how the ballots are being counted. And of course, we also have the Electoral Count Act, which is yet another problem. What happens when those ballots get to Washington, as we have seen in the headlines? But should CEOs get involved? Well, after the election was November 3rd, Tuesday night, November 3rd, 2020, of course. And there was a lot of ballots came in that looked like they were going one way, but it wasn't clear. But many states didn't yet start counting because they were, by statute, not allowed to. Say in Pennsylvania, they weren't allowed to open the ballots and count them until the polls were closed. So the write-ins or the mail-in ballots were largely going to go the other way because there are people who were more concerned about the pandemic, more believed in the risks, than didn't have vaccine protection yet. We were just weeks away from that. So they were fearful, and they were more. So the ballots were going to be imbalanced in the write-ins, and people were warning about that. And many CEOs, again, like Ken Frazier, among others, were warning, be prepared for what's going to happen with the second. But President Trump on Thursday night, the 5th, went on the national airways, first time ever, and declared himself the winner and made assertions that political scientists like Tim Snyder, as you saw, publicly called it a coup d'etat, and other political scientists did. Most CEOs thought that language was overblown. They don't feel that way now, but they felt that then. However, many of them started calling me. I can give you their names privately later, but they're names that would be at the tip of your tongue as some of the most prominent CEOs. And they were calling and texting or emailing in the middle of the news show, because when Trump made these claims, every network except Newsmax, Fox, and strangely CNN that left him on, every other one cut him off mid-sentence. That's just never happened before. And people were alarmed. So they said, well, you should pull a group of CEOs together. I said, what, me? Why don't you use the Business Roundtable? Why don't you use the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or the National Association of Manufacturers? I said, oh, no, they have complex agendas. They don't agree on anything, too much bureaucracy. You do it. I said, oh, you're right, because you all have wealth and reputation at risk. I got nothing to lose. So, we got together, our little team, and we invited 100 CEOs feverishly at 7 p.m. at the end of the news show hour for a meeting the next morning at 7 a.m. And believe it or not, of those 100, we had about 65 of them joined the call. Some of them weren't sure what they were getting into, and some of them you may have seen got quoted wrongly and are still mad at me on it because one person in the room leaked what was said and who was there. It wasn't quite right. But they still gathered because they were concerned, and they didn't clear it with their boards in advance. Ken Frazier, when he stepped off the business advisory councils, told his board, this is what I'm doing. You could back me or not, but this is what I'm doing. I can't speak for Merck. I'm speaking for myself. In this case, there's no time to clear anything with boards. Did they do the right thing? They thought so, and they were, believe me, they were across the political spectrum. Then I didn't think it'd be one and done. They came out with a statement, by the way, that is the statement that George Bush used, Netanyahu used it, Xi Jinping used it, and the BR, the Business Roundtable, everybody else used it. It was a 5-point statement that they themselves offered because Yale convened the event for them to make this happen. The first thing was, here's who won with the Biden-Harris win. Number two, if anybody disputes it, then they should go through the courts, the judicial process. And number three, if they do, they should produce sound evidence of systematic fraud, and we see none. Three,
And number 4, they said we expect a speedy transfer of power and other. And anyhow, that was basically the lines that, in that sequence, with a lot of the exact phrasing, they wrote it on Friday morning, the 6th, and then Saturday, midday the 7th, is when the Pennsylvania election was finally called. And instantly, this was the first statement went out there before Pelosi and Schumer had a chance to congratulate business CEOs. And Tim Snyder said it's critical. As opinion leaders, he said these are leaders of foundations in society. Richard Edelman's data showed this very profoundly of Edelman Communications. Morning Consult and Mark Penn of Harris, a more conservative poll, similarly found this, was that not only did employees want to see this from their CEOs to speak to social issues, overwhelmingly, 75 to 85%, depending on the issue, want to hear from their CEOs. But sadly, the most trusted voices in society, despite all those scandals that I've been studying for years, bewilderingly, they have been ascended. They have risen to corporate CEOs. And sorry, Josh, public officials have taken a hit backwards, even at the state level. Great hero here, Josh Cavalli. We're happy to have him back here as a deputy provost, but he was working with Governor Ned Lamont on some critical fronts. But state officials have surprisingly taken a hit lately, a big hit, and local officials, but federal officials for a long time, of course, and elected officials have lost a good deal of credibility. And the media, you know that, has lost a lot. Clergy, they've taken a step back. And academics, how outrageous. We've been hit. But who's ascendant are CEOs. So a lot of the political science people, and to your question about the research, is that we're being told that they're supposed to speak out. They should speak out. Does it matter if they speak out? Yes, here's evidence. Things would have gone differently if the business leaders hadn't come together and filled what would have been a frightening void. Nobody else spoke out. Now, some of you are about, almost as old as I am here in the room. And remember, we didn't rely on these CEOs in the 1960s. The Business Roundtable came together in 1970. And they were a little late to the party, but they were there correcting what they thought the rest of the business community had wrong. But in the 60s, it was church leaders, it was religious leaders across faiths locking arms. Where are they now on all these issues? You name an issue. And show me where I'm wrong, where we see interfaith collaboration on a large scale on the kinds of issues you're talking about. They're going for the easier issues, looking at issues on where the labor trade unions were out front. The campuses were alarmed and active, and professional associations and institutional investors. I mean, who's the largest owner of firearms in the country? The folks, I'll get in trouble for this one, but promoting ESG, some of the best. But I even said this to Larry Fink not that long ago on a podium. I said, you have the largest controlling stock of the 2 largest military-grade weapons makers. And he said, no, that's wrong. I said, really? He said, yes, the 3 largest. And he thought that was funny. Where are the institutional investors? So CEOs are someone out there on a limb. And to your point, Mark, they have some